I was telling you about the people today, how they think they got hard times. And a lot of the women do have hard times, especially single mothers. But I'm talking about an exceptional, very exceptional mother, mine. And I was telling you about how she was purchased from Italy, and she came here, finally found the guy who paid her passage and sent her money, and she met my father en route. And while my father was carrying her luggage to this Rico character, the guy who paid for her passage, he talked to her about how good he was and how bad Rico was. So by the time they got to the house, she wasn't too sure now. And then Rico inadvertently invites my father to stay for dinner because he found her and brought her to the house. Anyway, she was gorgeous. She was absolutely gorgeous, 18 years old. Later, I'll show you a picture of my mother and my father. It's a wedding picture. But anyway, he invited my father to the dinner. So all these Italians sitting around the dinner table, and my father was sitting next to my cousin, or his cousin, I'm sorry, and then my mother, and then Rico. So for my father to look at my mother, he had to look around the cousin who was in the way. So Rico stands up and he holds his glass up and he said, "Okay, I'd like to toast my new bride from Italy, and we will be getting married this Saturday." So everybody cheers and they all toast. My father did not stand up. He looked around and he tapped my mother on the shoulder. And she looked at him, he went. And then so in sign language, he kind of told her he was going to be her husband. Well, halfway through the dinner, Rico was talking about when they get married, what they're going to be doing. My mother stood up and she said, "No, I'm not going to marry you." And everybody was shocked into silence. And they couldn't believe it, and they wanted to know why. And she looked at, my father's name was Francesca Di Felici. She looked over at Frank, and she pointed to him. She said, "I'm going to marry him." And my father smiles. And she says, "But he not going to marry me until he pays Rico every dime he spent. Then I'm going to marry him." Well, that's how my mother and father got together. And my father did pay. Paid all the passage, the ship, what money he had sent. But this was the beginning of what, we thought was going to be a beautiful marriage and a beautiful relationship. Because they liked each other pretty much when they first met. But it was also the beginning of some really unusual events and some unbelievable people that became involved with our family. And this is what I want to talk about, because when we went through these hard times, especially my mother, went through these hard times, it was handled by everybody. And there was a great deal of determination. So my father worked as a section hand on the railroad. It's called a nickel plate railroad. And there was another one called New York Central. This is in Ohio now. When he was working there, he gradually got promoted until he was foreman of the section hand. And we had a total of 13 children. Now, two of the children died before I was born, so I never met two of them. So there were 11 at any one time alive, and I was the baby. My father was approached by two men in a big, slick Model T Ford or whatever it was. They were dressed in suits and hats. And I went up to him and they said, "You're Francesco De Felice?" He said, "Yeah." He says, "Okay, we with La Cosa Nostra or the Black Hand." There's so many names for the mafia. They have like the Black Hand, the Cosa Nostra, the mafia, and so on. But the main thing is they were people who run the Italian organization. So this guy tells my father that he cannot hire anybody unless he told him who to hire. Because he would hire people that had to pay back to the mafia so much money. So my father said, "I'm not going to pay that. That's stupid. I'm not going to hire who you tell me to." And the guy warned him. He said, "We have ways." He said, "I don't care." So my father, when he went home that night, now remember, my mother's busy with all these kids. He mentions to my mother, well, my mother had a brother named Charlie who lived in Italy. So she sends Charlie a cablegram. My father didn't even know this, but Charlie was the hitman for the Sicilians in Italy. And the cablegram said, "Can you help Francesco?" So here comes this hitman from Italy who is my mother's brother. And he visits the gentleman who told my father that he had to work for them. So to make a long story short, the mafia apologized to my father, and they said, "Anytime you need anything, you let us know." And my father was just confused because he did not know all of this occurred. So when he went home and told my mother, by the way, my mother's name is Pauline, but we used to call it Pasqualina. That's the Italian version. It was Pauline. And my father tells my mother that he couldn't understand it. And my mother just explained to him that she sent a cablegram to her brother in Italy. So now things started getting confusing. My father was not mixed up with the mafia. My mother was. And through her brother, of course. While working on the railroad, my father put his hand into a keg of these big spikes that they pound into the ties. And they're rusty. And he cut his hand. He didn't look after it. He didn't put anything on it. And 2 days later, this blood poisoning started on the first two fingers and moved up the back of his hand. So they go to the doctor, the hospital, and the guy said, "They're going to have to come off." He says, "That's blood poisoning." And by the way, this is before penicillin, before antibiotics. So they told my father that he had to cut his fingers off. My father said no, he'd worry about it. So he was dipping it in hot water and sulfur. Next thing you know, it went all the way up to his wrist. The doctor again begged him to let him cut his hand off. My father wouldn't let him do it. Then it went up his arm. And then finally the doctor said, "Well, now We have to take your arm or you're going to die. And my father was kind of overly optimistic because he said, it'll go down, it'll go down. Well, it did not. And it went all the way up. My father died of blood poisoning at the age of 40. My mother was 39 with 11 children. She received from the railroad $200. And that's all the money she had in the world, and 11 kids. Now from here, and by the way, she could not read or write, barely spoke English. So here's where our story really begins. And I'll get back with you, and I hope I didn't bore you too much. Thank you.